between Milton Keynes and a yoghurt.
I don't know. What is
Ah, you've heard this one before. A yoghurt has culture. So welcome to Once Upon a Milton Keynes. And, well, it is going to be a collection of tales, of old stories about this new town. And there's going to be personal stories, there's going to be folk tales, there are some histories, and there are even the odd urban myths slung in there. And up here you can see that there are some media stories. Media stories are quite difficult to orate, so that's how they got into the show. They've got a nice little poster up there so you can check those out during the interval. So I'll be telling for roughly about an hour, and then you get a chance to recharge your glasses, have some more cake, and give me some feedback. The most important thing, because this is all part of my PhD. So you can leave some post-it note feedbacks if you only want to do something small. You can fill out a questionnaire, or there are some strips of paper just there that give you information about how to get to the website if you have a story about Milton Keynes which you would like to leave. So there are lots of different ways that you can leave feedback that I can then go away, generate some data, and hopefully come out of all of this in PhD.
So to pass around a couple of post-it notes then, so we can do it while we...
Oh, you want to do it while we're doing it? Okay.
I forget, yeah.
Right, fair enough. Oh, there you go. A pen and a pad.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful.
Oh, yeah, I'm good at assessment.
I feel like now I'm at school and going to be assessed on everything.
You asked for it, literally.
Oh, well, this is true. I did indeed. So, with all of these different stories, I'm going to start with a personal tale. My own personal tale, which is not something that I usually do. After meeting this lovely lady over here, she encouraged me to take a step in storytelling that I hadn't really done before. And so, let's go back to that joke that I told at the start. Well, that was the very first comment that I heard when I arrived in Milton Keynes for the first time in 2013. And I actually arrived just down the road. I went to Madcap, or Creed Street as it was known then, and that evening I was surrounded by other storytellers, musicians, actors, artists, and even a gentleman whose name was Danny Quinn, who runs this lovely establishment. That was the first time I met him, the first time I've been in Milton Keynes. And I was very confused. I thought it was odd for somebody to tell me that there was no cultural heritage when there was I in a lovely Victorian building surrounded by all these artistic types. How very unusual indeed. And the mystery only got deeper, because over the following months I was asked to do lots of other storytelling and events, and I became a living history actress down at Bletchley Park. I was performing local stories in schools and at events, and I ended up becoming the education officer at the City Discovery Centre. My job was literally to tell people from all over the world and people nearby the stories of Milton Keynes. And so how could so many people wander around every single day without knowing that there was all of this heritage round and about? I could see the stories sneaking about, hiding from corners. And it was then that I realised that there was a story louder than them all. A story that I had been told before I even arrived. That story of concrete cows and roundabouts. Warning, you'll get lost in the labyrinth. And that story sings out so loud, so deafening, it hides all the other stories. Milton Keynes is new and therefore has no culture or heritage. And as somebody from Milton Keynes, you see it on people's faces when you tell them where you live. You see it in their reactions. They scoff a little bit. They tighten themselves up. I got to realise it firsthand when I popped down to Buckingham Palace for tea with the Queen and Phil. Oh, lovely night with Auntie Bessie. We had jelly, as you do when you go to the Queen's house. Well, Prince Philip, he asked me where I was from. He'd already made some disparaging comments about storytellers, so then he moved on to where I live. And I said, I come from Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes? Why on earth would anybody want to live in Milton Keynes? And there you have it, in a nutshell. That's what them out there think about us in here. And even though we know it's wrong, we still listen, we still believe, we still tell ourselves jokes that we have no culture or heritage. But is it true? Do you really believe that Milton Keynes has no cultural heritage?
Tell us.
Do you agree or disagree?
Have no opinions.
You have no opinions. Oh, well, hopefully by the time that I finish telling, hopefully I will have given you something to think about and have some opinions. So, the trouble is, the national narrative is there saying we don't have stories, we don't have heritage and culture, and the stories, well, they all tell us we do. And I'm afraid to say, as a storyteller, I'm always going to side with the stories. You might know some stories about Milton Keynes, and if you do, you might come across a few of them. I know that you'll know most of them as we've gone through, because this is your third time round. You're only missing one behind Rue. He's been watching this 4 times. There are prizes given out. So, I suppose I better get on with the story. But the reason that I'm here tonight, as I said, is all because of my PhD. So I'm doing a practical project called Knowing My Milton Keynes. When the opportunity came up in 2016 to do a PhD at Loughborough University, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. By that point, I was so frustrated with people telling me that there was no cultural heritage, no stories in Milton Keynes, when I knew that there was loads. I thought, right, I have to get to the bottom of this, because it's something that is frustrating me in my life as a resident now of Milton Keynes, and also as a performer dealing with these stories of heritage. I wanted to get to the bottom of it. 2 years in, I'm not entirely sure I'm getting any closer to the bottom of it, but I am finding a lot of interesting stories as I go, and I'm going to share them with you tonight. So, everybody knows that there are stories about the roundabouts, and that there are stories about the concrete cows. And so this is where I'm going to start. The roundabouts. It is said that we have so many roundabouts here in Milton Keynes because when the developers were all pouring ideas out over the plans and making their marks, it took them long hours. And so there they were with their coffee cups drinking down. They didn't have time to wander to the other side of the room and politely put their coffee cups down. Oh no, they were slurping. Oh, that should go here, that should go there, placing their coffee cups down on the plans. And by the time they got to the end, there was a whole bunch of circles all around, and thus the roundabouts came to Milton Keynes. Well, it's a lovely story, but it's not quite true. The truth of it is that when Milton Keynes was first being planned, they built the infrastructure first. They built the roadways, they built the sewage pipes, and they laid the electrical lines. And so it was the local borough council who had to make up the ideas and the plans for how these crossings would work. And the law at the time said that if you were in a rural area, a junction had to be governed by a roundabout, not traffic lights. That was for an urban area. Well, of course, there was all these roads, and next to them were fields where eventually houses would be, but those houses weren't there. And so when they decided what was going to happen with those junctions, the borough council said it was a rural area, they must be roundabouts, even if that was only to be temporary. But by the time they had filled in all of those fields with houses and businesses, well, the roundabouts, well, they kind of stuck. And so they've been here ever since. And we've got around about 130 of them and 8 different species. So the next time you go driving around Milton Keynes, don't just think, oh, here we go, another roundabout. Do check what species it is, what type, how big, how small, whether it's raised, because there's more to our roundabouts than you think. But where was the first roundabout? Well, here we are in lovely Wolverton, and if you head on down, you eventually come to Stony Stratford. And as you go down the Stratford-Wolverton road, you go underneath the M1. Well, the roundabout that is just past the M1 tunnel, that there was supposedly the very first roundabout built as part of the new town of Milton Keynes. But the very first roundabout goes back even earlier. And again, it joins Wolverton and Stony Stratford. Because when the Wolverton works were at their height, then the tram carrying 100 people, it was the largest tram in the world, ferried people backwards and forwards between Wolverton and Stony Stratford every single day. And they would take the men in the morning to the works, and then at lunchtime they'd go back so the wives could place hot meals on the tram, and the tram would just carry the hot meals to bring to the hungry workers, and then in the evening it would ferry them back. But although when it was here at Wolverton, the engine for the tram would move round to the other side, at Stony Stratford there was no facilities to do that, so it quite literally had to turn around, and it turned around just outside of where the Plough pub is. And so, if you want to find where the very first roundabout in Milton Keynes is, that's the one you're looking at. And we're going to stick in Stony Stratford just for a moment, because talking about the trams, if you go down Stony Stratford High Street, you'll come to a shop called Odell's, and it's an ironmonger's, and people think it's been there for years and years and years, and it has been there for a long time. And it's true that there has been a blacksmith working on that site since the 1400s. But James Odell, well, he is the great-great-grandfather of the current Mr. Odell. And it was James Odell who set up Odell's. He moved to Stony and opened the shop. And a few days after he opened the shop, a man with a black cap came in. And he had a bit of sign under his arm in the shape of a circle. And he placed it on the desk, and he said to James Odell, he says, "I want 2 of them in glass with a beveled edge." Well, James Odell said, well, I can do that for you, but that's going to be really expensive to get that sent off. Are you sure you want 2 of them? Yes, I need 2 of them because they're for their headlights for the tram. Well, James Odell thought, brilliant, great. If they need 2 of them now, they might need more in the future. So I won't just order 2, I'll order 3. So I've got 1 in stock in case they need it. And so that's exactly what James Odell did. The 2 turned up, they were taken, they were put on the tram went backwards and forwards, And as for that 3rd one, well, if you go into Odell's to this very day, they've still got it in stock. So it just goes to show the quality of glass back then. But I did promise cows. About 50 years ago, again if you go down Stony High Street, where Costa now is, was another ironmonger's. It was called Chippendales, and a section of it was a glass and china shop. And one day, the local farmer was herding his cows down Stony Stratford High Street, as was the wont to do at the time. This wasn't an unusual thing. It was how they could get them down to Tombs fields down at the bottom, so that's where they could go and graze on common land. So they were herding these cows down the high street when one of the cows broke away from the pack, and it decided, or from the herd, and it decided it was going to go for a little shopping spree. And it trotted into Chippendales, the ironmongers, and into the china and glass section. Well, you've heard of a bull in a china shop. This was a cow in a china shop. Milton Keynes likes to do things differently. And it trotted round, and it wasn't the catastrophe that you might expect. The cow very calmly made its way round, decided there was nothing it wanted to buy today, and out it went and joined the rest of its herd. So that goes to prove that not all cows in Milton Keynes are concrete. And the concrete cows themselves, well, some of you may already know that they were created by Liz Lay. She was here as resident artist for a few years. She actually came from America, and so when her time was up, she made the concrete cows as a parting present, and she left them at Stacey Bush's farm, as it was back then. And so there they were, and off she went. She never dreamed that they would become the icon of Milton Keynes that they have, but now they seem to be a symbol for us, mixing our rural and urbanness together. But from concrete cows to a from-crete cow, because I want to tell you a story that is connected with Milton Keynes, but maybe you might not realise it. Because once, a very long time ago, and a very long way away, there was a hero, and his name was Theseus. And Theseus, well, some say he was the son of Poseidon, and others say that he was the son of King Aegeus of Athens, and some say there was a mixture of the two going on in there. But whatever the story was, Theseus made his way to Athens to meet his father for the first time when he was already a young man and an established hero. And when he arrived in Athens, he came at a most unfortunate time. You see, every year Athens had to send 7 boys and 7 girls, or 7 young men and 7 young women, over to Crete, to King Minos, who lived in Knossos. And their fate was to be taken down into a labyrinth, and there to meet a mighty beast, a minotaur, half man, half bull, who fed on the flesh of human beings. Well, Theseus thought that this was a terrible fate for the young people of Athens, and so he said to his father, I will go, I will defeat this terrible minotaur. And so his father said, you can go, but make sure on your way back you sail with white sails so I know that you were successful. Theseus agreed. He hopped on the boat. They went over to Crete, and there, whilst being partied and having a celebration the night before being eaten, Theseus met Ariadne, King Minos' daughter, and she was beautiful. She was stunning. Theseus couldn't take his eyes off her. She couldn't take her eyes off of him. And so in an instant, she agreed to help him. She gave him a clue to that labyrinth. Theseus went down. He went into the labyrinth. He met the Minotaur and defeated it and came out with the head. He'd killed the Minotaur, he rescued the fair maid, he got on the boat and off they went. And so the story should have a happy ending. It gets a bit wayward in places. Ariadne got left on an island, but it was okay. She ended up marrying Bacchus, the god of wine and theatre. And Theseus, he went back to Athens, but he had forgotten to put those white sails on. He left the black sails on. So when King Aegeus saw the ship coming towards him, he thought that his son was dead and threw himself from the cliffs down, splosh. And that is why it's now known as the Aegean Sea. So why does an ancient Greek myth have any connection to Milton Keynes, apart from my bad from Crete cow story gag? Well, there are a couple of connections, to be honest. Dame Joan Evans, well, she was quite a well-to-do lady, and she was brought by her nanny, Caroline Hancock, every summer to Caroline's parents, who lived in Milton Keynes village. And she ended up writing her memoirs about her life as a young girl in the area. And she speaks very fondly of Milton Keynes village and the Broughton area. But her half-brother, Arthur Evans, was the archaeologist who went to Crete and dug up most of Knossos and found the labyrinth. But that's not the only connection. The other connection is when the Milton Keynes Development Corporation wanted a logo for their new company, for the corporation, they thought long and hard about what they would have. And they thought back to the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and they realised something. That Knossos was the very first planned city ever built, because it was constructed above that labyrinth. And so if that was the very first planned city to be built anywhere in the world, well, why not connect it to the very last city to be built as part of the 1946 New Towns Act? So they decided that they would link the old with the new, something that has been going on with Milton Keynes all the way through. And so they used the double-headed Minoan axe symbol that can be found all over Knossos and even in the labyrinth where that Minotaur used to rant and rule. But it's not a story, strictly speaking, of the area. The oldest story of this area is one about a man named Caradoc, or Caradoc. You see, he was the son of Celumbine, who used to like to parade it round and be known as Rex Britannicus, because he was ruling his Iron Age tribe, the Cataballones, just as the Romans came in. And he wanted to impress those Romans because he wanted to be on the good side of them. But his son Caradoc, he didn't care whether he was on the good side of the Romans or not. He thought they were a bad thing, and so he gathered his troops and they started to fight against the Roman army. They used guerrilla warfare, jumping out and attacking them. And little by little, they started to push the Romans back. But then Caradoc, after about 8 years of doing rather well, got a little bit cocky. He thought, well, you know, we seem to be holding our own. We'll meet those Romans on the field. But field battle was something that Romans knew how to do very, very well. They created their turtle shape with their shields up, and they marched forwards. And unfortunately for the Iron Age warriors who were used to fighting person to person, the Romans, well, they never fought person to person. They held their shields with one side and they would always stab the person to the side of them. And so it was a slaughter. Caradoc barely escaped, but escape he did. And he started to run north as fast as he possibly could. He knew that in the north there was a tribe larger than his own tribe, the Cataballones, which was so huge it went from Northampton down right the way through Buckinghamshire, across into Oxford and Cambridgeshire. It was a massive area, but the Brigantes, the northern tribe, was massive. And the Brigantes was such a huge tribe that that's why the Romans named Britain Britannia, after the Brigante tribe. Right, off Caradoc went as quickly as he possibly could, trying to get north. And the queen of the Brigantes, she sent word ahead. She said, Caradoc, I hear you're coming. You'll be safe. Come here, you'll be fine. We'll look after you from those nasty, nasty Romans. You won't need to worry about them. And so Caradoc, he crossed the border, and as soon as he did, he found himself slapped in irons by the Brigante tribe. And the queen of the Brigantes herself handed him over to the Romans. Betrayed by his own people. He was taken down through Europe and into Rome, and there placed on a cart, paraded through the streets of Rome while people threw rotten vegetables and shit at him and hurled abuse, until finally he arrived at the Senate. And there he stood in front of them as they told him all the ways that they were going to make him suffer, all of those ways that he was just a barbarian. And then they asked him, before they sent him off to be executed as a war criminal, what he had to say for himself. Well, they didn't expect much, did they? He was just a barbarian after all. Barbarians can't think, can they? But Caradoc stood there. He sized up the Senate and he said, your victory is only great because I was a great hero. I was a great warrior. If you had defeated me easily, you wouldn't be able to claim a great victory right now. It is because I fought you for 8 whole years that now you can sit there proud that you finally won. Well, the Senate, they heard his words and they realised the truth of them. They realised that if they were to execute him now, it would probably reflect quite badly on them. And so not only did they grant him his life, they granted him his freedom. They made him a free citizen of Rome. And so he got to live out the rest of his days in sunny boulevards, eating grapes, drinking wine, having olives. The only thing was he wasn't allowed to come back ever to rainy, grey Britain. I think he did all right in the end. And so that is the oldest story of one of the people who would have been living around this area. And it's long before Boudica made her way up the Watling Street to her final battle. So we have an ancient history here. And we've been part of many, many, many stories, nationally and locally. If we look on the national scale, we've been part of a lot of King Edward stories. So there was King Edward I. He brought his wife Eleanor, her funeral corsage down through the, or funeral procession, down through the Watling Street. So it stopped at Stony Stratford. And so King Edward came through here, that was the first. King Edward IV, he also turned up. He was staying in Stony Stratford when he fell in love with Elizabeth Woodville, secretly married her, caused a little bit of a hoo-ha at the end of the War of the Roses, and then a few years later, his son, Edward V, well, he was staying in Stony Stratford when his dastardly uncle, can we have a boo and a hiss? It is panto season nearly as it is. So yeah, his dastardly uncle, Richard the Duke of Gloucester, Richard III as he would later be known, caught up with his young nephew, Edward V, captured him, took him down to the Tower of London, and he was never seen again. Edward. Not Richard. He was seen again, unfortunately. But we have also been part of another national story, which you may or may not know about. Some of you might have enjoyed some fireworks just recently and bonfire night. Well, why do we celebrate bonfire night? What's the reason behind it? Somebody tell me. Guy Fawkes, yes indeed. It is in celebration that Guy Fawkes was thwarted the gunpowder plot. But did you know that that gunpowder plot was hatched right here in Milton Keynes? Just across the way at Newport Pagnell, just next to that, there's a place called Gayhurst Manor. And way back when, that manor was owned by a chap named Sir Everard Digby. What a name that is! You can just imagine the cut of the man, his doublet and hose walking around. Yes, that's Sir Everard. Well, Sir Everard, he was a really well-renowned gentleman, but he was also a Catholic. And the trouble with that was that at the time, being a Catholic was not a done thing whatsoever. Because you'd had King Henry VIII. He had done away with Catholicism because he wanted to get rid of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn. And so then Protestant, so he became Protestant and made the whole country Protestant. But then when his daughter Anne came to the throne, she changed it all back to being Catholic, and then they changed it back with Elizabeth back to being Protestant. So nobody knew whether they were coming or going. It was troubled times. And because of that, Sir Everard, who was a Catholic, had to hide his faith. He had a secret room at Gayhurst built, and it was because he was a secret Catholic that he came in contact with Guy Fawkes. And Guy Fawkes, well, he needed somewhere to create his plots and his plans, close enough to London so he could go and check out the landscape, but somewhere just far enough away that he wouldn't be overheard. And so he went to Gayhurst. At first, Sir Everard didn't want anything to do with it. He was a good religious man. There must be another way to do this. But slowly but surely, Guy Fawkes, with his silver tongue, convinced him. And thus, Sir Everard became embroiled in the plot, and the plan was made right there at Gayhurst. And off, down, Guy Fawkes went to London, ready for the 5th of November. And Sir Everard, well, his job was to go to Worcestershire and to pretend to be hunting that day, because he was just going to be close enough to the place that they were holding James I's daughter, Elizabeth, so that he could capture her, and therefore they would have some leverage. But as we all know, things went wrong. One of their number gave the game away. Guy Fawkes was captured, and soon after, so too was Everard. And they were both taken to the Tower of London to wait their execution. A treasonous execution. And so they were taken, they were drawn through the streets of London, then they were hung till they were unconscious, they were placed on the table, their guts were opened up, pulled out, put on a brazier to burn a little bit while they were still alive. And when you are executed and hung, drawn and quartered as a traitor, there's one other thing that the executioner does. They reach up through your guts, up into your chest, and they pull out your still beating heart. They hold it up to the crowd and they say, "This be the heart of a traitor!" But when they did that with Sir Everard, with his dying breath, he shouted out, "Thou liest, sir!" And with that, he was no more. But there was a gunpowder plot closer to home as well. On the 25th of November, 1859, in fact, there was a gentleman whose name was George Atkins, and he was a local to Wolverton. He'd opened up a drapery business down in Bradwell. He had owned the Crawford Arms here in Wolverton, and he was running a grocery shop in Stony Stratford High Street. Well, on the 25th of November 1859, one of his workers was just closing up the shop. Now, I should point out this was during the Victorian era, and George was very much a Victorian businessman. He expected his workers to work long, hard hours for very little pay. Well, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling him a Scrooge. That was the way things were done back there. People were expected to do that. But he operated by those standards, so you can imagine that he might not have been best loved by his workers. Well, this particular worker, she was getting ready to close up for the day, and she noticed a strange bit of rope on the floor leading to the stock room. When she took a closer inspection, she saw it was covered with saltpetre. This is not the type of salt you find on your dinner table. Saltpetre is quite flammable. In fact, some might say it's explosive. Well, the worker followed this, opened the door, and when she opened the door, there was a trail of gunpowder leading to 2 large barrels in the stockroom. The police were called. They came in and they estimated that it would have been enough to blow up not just the shop, but the flat above, and it would have certainly killed and maimed quite a few people. Well, the police asked George Atkins if he knew of anybody who might have been, well, out to get him. George said that he could think of 1 or 2 people that might spring to mind, but that he'd like to deal with it himself. And so the police dropped the case, and a couple of people were routinely fired. But it seemed to have solved it, because George, for as much as I can ascertained, carried on running his business with no other death threats going. But that was the gunpowder plot of Wolverton and Stony Stratford. Little did you know.
That's worth celebrating alone.
It is.
Surely.
25th of November. So on Sunday, I want everybody in Stony Stratford and Wolverton to get out their fireworks and their bonfires. And when everybody says, why are you doing it? You're 20 days late, we'll go, ah, not so. It's a local story for local people. Right. So, other local stories. I very often at this point tell the story of a lady called Madam Bent. And I'm going to skip through because we're pushing it for time. And there were so many stories I found about Wolverton. So I'm going to skip through the Grace Bennet story just enough so that you get a little taste. Because Grace Bennet, she was known as Madam Bennet. She, again, was a bit of an unsavoury type, not a very pleasant lady. Her husband, Simon Bennet, was lovely. He used to give to the poor of the Calverton side of Stony Stratford because he lived at Calverton Manor Farm along with Grace. But when he died, Grace stopped giving to the poor. She wouldn't even let people come and collect wood from her land, which was the done thing. If you had a large estate, you let the poor come and collect wood. It meant that they could light their homes and warm them, and you got rid of all the debris on your land. So it worked out quite well. But no, Grace wouldn't even let servants go out and do it. She did it herself because she was so mean and horrible. Well, you can imagine when her cousin Adam Barnes, a butcher at Stony Stratford, popped over and said, Grace, dearest cousin, lovely lassie you are, I'm a bit short of the old coffers this month. Any chance I can have a bit of money? Well, she turned round and told him no, in no uncertain terms. And it broke out into a bit of an argument. And Adam went home very cross, very frustrated. He went down the pub, he started telling his friends. He started drinking. And this only made his anger worse. And so that night, in the dead of night, he picked up the tools of his butcher's trade and he made his way back to Calverton Farm and he set to work on Madam Bennet. They say there was so much blood it stained the stone. In reality, they later found out that there was iron ore going through the stone, but it ruins a good story. And so, 4 years, no matter how much they scrubbed, they could not get the blood out. Well, Adam was arrested. He was taken down to the assizes. They held a temporary court down in the Cross Keys pub in Stony Stratford. He was taken upstairs, he was found guilty, and he was taken to Gallows Hill, now lovingly known as Galley Hill. And there he hung until he was dead. But that wasn't enough. He'd done such a terrible crime, they wanted to make an example of him. So they took his body down and they put it in a gibbet, which they hung from the road going from Galley Hill, or Gallows Hill, down to Calverton. It's now known as Gibbs Lane. It was originally known as Gibbets Lane. And there he was hung in that gibbet until the birds had picked all the flesh from his bones. But even that wasn't enough, because then they took his skull. They put a big pike just outside of Calverton Manor Farm and put his head on it, just to make sure that anybody passing the way who thought they might get up to no good would know better. And so that was the end of Adam Barnes. But Gibbs Lane is part of an ancient ridgeway that has been going since medieval times, and it goes through Gibbs Lane, it carries on through the ridgeway through Greenleys, and it joins up with Green Lane here in Wolverton. And at the time, Green Lane was a long lane that went all the way down till it met to Gibbs Lane. And it was a lovely wooded lane. It was quite secluded. It was a good place to go and pick your mushrooms at that time of year. It was a good place to go and pick a fight if you had something that you wanted to deal with out of sight of the local constabulary. It was also a very good place to go for a walk with your lover It was secluded, it was wooded, it was quiet. And this was where Mabel Timms and Richard and Charles Haynes went when they first started stepping out together. They both worked at Wolverton Works. That's where they had met, and they'd taken a shine to each other, and so they went to Green's Lane. Oh, and they were so very much in love, and they started to make plans, and eventually, after a little bit of time had gone past, well, Charles asked Mabel to marry him. Mabel wasn't so excited. She started planning for the day. It was going to be brilliant. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be the best day of her life. She was so in love with Charles, and she knew that Charles was so in love with her. What could go wrong? This is a story, so you know something's going to. After 3.5 years of being in love with making plans for a future together, well, one lunchtime they met up, as they used to do, but something was odd that day, Mabel noticed. Charles, rather than embracing her as he usually did, or giving her a quick peck on the cheek when nobody was looking, that didn't happen that day. He sort of took a step back. He was a bit cold and didn't really want to know. And she asked what was the matter. And he avoided her questions for a little while until he said, "Mabel, I just can't do it anymore. I don't want to marry you." Cut like a knife. Her mind buzzed, and she said, well, it's just cold feet. Maybe you'll think differently tomorrow or next week. Don't make any rash plans right now. But he said, "No, Mabel, I've really thought about it. I've thought long and hard. I don't want to marry you. It's over." In that moment, her world broke. Her dreams shattered. Her life turned upside down. Everything that she thought she knew completely evaporated. She felt like she was falling through an endless hole. She fell to her knees. She begged him to reconsider. She said that how could she live without him? And he said, "Just go back to work. You'll get into your work. You'll get over it. Give it a bit of time." She says, "How can I go back to work? Everybody there, they're going to know I'm going to look like a fool. I'm going to look like an idiot. I can't go back to work. I can't go home. I can't go anywhere. You'll never see me again." And off she ran. Charles tried to tell her to stop being hysterical, but she was gone. She made her way to where now the Galleon pub is, to the bridge that goes over the canal. And it was a cold and icy day, just so much so that ice was beginning to form on that canal. And she stopped. She looked down at that water. The water seemed so calm, so peaceful, so at rest, so still, all the things that she wasn't feeling. And so she stared. A few moments later, a gentleman by the name of Leonard Rose was making his way from Newport Pagnell down past the Galleon pub across that canal, and it was such a cold day that he thought to himself, "Oh, I wonder if ice is forming on the canal yet. It must be. It's really nippy. It's definitely that time of year, and well, you know, if ice is forming, that means I can maybe have a mulled ale by the time I get to Stony Stratford. That would be lovely." And so he peered over the edge of the bridge, and when he looked down, sure enough, there was a bit of ice on the canal. But there was also a woman's hat in the water, and he stared at it. He looked around to see if any lady might have had her hat blown off in the wind. And then when he looked back a second time, suddenly a head bobbed up, and he realised that somebody was in the canal. Mabel had leapt. She had decided to end it all. But Leonard, who didn't know this, thought that she might have fallen in, and so he dashed round, and being a good sort, he dived in and he rescued her. He got her out of the water, managed to find out where she lived, and he took her home for a bit of tea and sympathy from her friends and family. Leonard was heralded a hero. Charles was told, well, you're better off out of that one. She's a bit cuckoo, isn't she? I mean, look at it, throwing herself off. And as for Mabel, she'd had her dreams shattered. She'd had her heart broken. She had been half drowned, half frozen. And then the police turned up to arrest her, because at the time it was a criminal offence to try and commit suicide. So talk about having a bad week. Not only did she lost the love of her life, she now also had a criminal record to boot. I would like to tell you that there is a happy ending to this story. I'd like to tell you that there's any ending to this story, but I'm still researching what actually happened to Mabel. I hope to come back one day and say that I found out that she did move on with her life. She did get married and maybe have a nice time of it far away from that dastardly Charles. I'm even trying to find out what happened to Charles. Hopefully something not too nice. But this is true life stories, so who knows? They don't always have a happy ending. But we've spoken about the works a little bit. The great establishment that set up Wolverton. The Wolverton works because of the railway. And when Wolverton was, as we know it now, New Wolverton was first created, it was known not as Old Wolverton and New Wolverton, but it was known as Wolverton and Wolverton Station. So that was the whole name of the entire town. And it was the 17th of September 1838. Yes, it was one of those dates that doesn't quite stick, but it did this time. That the actual train station opened up, and it was all very, very exciting. You see, down at Euston, there was all sorts of dignitaries getting on. There was the chairman of the works, there was the locomotive superintendent who had designed the engine, there was the secretary of the works, there was the engineer, Robert Stevenson, there was also the Duke of Sussex. They all hopped on at Euston, and the train, that steam locomotive, started to make its way up the train line. It took 2 hours until they finally reached Wolverton, and I should say, when they arrived to quite a celebration. It was like a county fair. There were stalls and booths everywhere. They were selling food and entertainment. There was fun, there was games, and most of the workers had been given the day off, and they were given free bread, beer and beef. It was an exceptional day. They say that the celebration started at the station and went all the way into Stony Stratford, all the way down the road. And so when that first train pulled in, there was a great whoop and a cheer like this. Woo!
Hooray!
It was much louder than that. We're going to try that again. There was a great whoop and a cheer like this.
Hooray!
Lovely. And the dignitaries, they got off of the train. They did all of their speeches. They had to fill in about an hour because that's how long it took to get a new engine to put on the train to take it further up the track. That used to have to be done. And so there was all this celebration. Everybody was happy and jolly. On they got on the train and off they went. About an hour later, the next train came through. This one was filled with first class carriages and 4 gentlemen's carriages. And so when that pulled into the station, everybody was excited. They gave her a whoop and a cheer like this.
Hooray!
And there was more partying for the next hour as the trains were turned round, and then that train went. And then about an hour later, they were expecting the next train, and they waited. Because they were really wanting some more free beer and bread and beef. They waited, they waited, and they waited, and the train didn't show up. In a way, it was the first delayed train of British Rail. And they waited, and they waited, and suddenly news came through that just outside of Wolverton, the fire basket had dropped off of the train, and so suddenly the workers all got together, went running down the track, they fixed the train, and about 3 hours late the train came in to Wolverton train station, and they all whooped and cheered like this.
Hooray!
And when the train driver got off and said, well, why are you all cheering? We've held you up by 3 hours. Why are you not miserable? And they said, well, the moment you leave, the day of celebration is over, so you've just extended it by 3 hours. So we've had more bread, beer and beef. Hooray! And so, it seems that not every delayed train is a cause for misery, although you might have different viewpoints on that after your journey tonight. And so, a nice little story about Wolverton wax. But let's bring us back, because I also promised some urban myths. Well, we did do an urban myth with the roundabouts, but there are a few other urban myths about Milton Keynes. If this screen wasn't here right now, you'd see that right here in Bar, they have a quote, and underneath it says, Jimi Hendrix. Well, I have a story about Jimi Hendrix that happened in Bletchley, and I've done a bit of investigating about this story, and I'm not so sure it's an urban myth. It might start to fall under the histories category, because people at Marshall's do not deny it's happened. And then when I told this at the Broughton event, somebody came up to me and went, yeah, that's true. And I was like, oh! So this story now, not so much an urban myth. But back in, I think, going back a few years before the designation of Milton Keynes, down in Woburn Sands, they were planning a flower festival, and they told the Duke of Bedfordshire about this flower festival and could they use his land, and he was like, oh, I do quite like flowers, yes, it'd be lovely to have a flower festival. It's such a shame that me and the wife aren't going to be around that weekend, we're just popping off, so we'll leave you good chaps to have your lovely flower festival. It will be delightful. So they were thinking it was going to be a lovely array of blooms and scented plants, but actually what it was a good old hippie festival. There was music, there was drugs, there was drinking, there was free love for all, and there was Jimi Hendrix. Somehow or another, they had convinced the great god that Jimi Hendrix was at the time to come and play this little 2-bit hippie festival, and turn up he did. And there he was, playing away, everybody was going wild, and it was known at the time that he always used Marshall amps. And then in the middle of his gig, his amp failed. Jimmy hit the roof, he was furious, and so the next day he made his way to Bletchley. He went into the Marshall's shop that was on the high street of Bletchley, just down from the co-op, and he went in, threw open the doors. Apparently he was wearing his nice purple flares and his huge great big afro. I left my afro at home tonight, but I do have the purple flares. And he went in there and he threw the amp across the room. He was a mighty man, about 6'4", some say, and threw it in, raging, roaring his disgust at the workmanship of this Marshall amp, and then strode out down the high street of Bletchley. Well, the people in the shop, well, they were phoning up Marshall's head office. They were going, Jimmy's just been in, he's really not happy, the amp failed. And so all the people at Marshall's were scattered all over Bletchley trying to find Jimi Hendrix. You wouldn't think Jimi Hendrix would be too hard to find in his purple flares walking down Bletchley High Street, but apparently they were scattered, they were looking, and they caught up with him just outside the co-op. And there they subdued him a little bit. They promised that they'd do whatever it is to make things better. And off they went. And, well, there's another bit of the story that you were telling me the other day, that then that's apparently how he invented a bit of the ample. Or
Yeah, apparently. Well, I heard from a chap, Tom Gochan, when I was at school, that Jimmy had asked for 10 amplifiers from Jim Marshall, and at the time, Bletchley used to have the leisure centre, which had this beautiful snake-like pathway with rainbow-coloured Bletchley ensigned upon it. And of course, I was aware that Jimi Hendrix had done an album called Rainbow Bridge, so I fused those things. Obviously, Jimmy had come to Bletchley, and then the other evening, I heard your story about Jimi Hendrix coming to Bletchley, and to be honest, I couldn't have been happier.
And so it seems that the great legend really did come to Bletchley and cause chaos, which is quite fun. So an urban myth, another one that is true, but maybe not so true, you don't know. Derek Walker, he was one of the chaps who helped build and design Milton Keynes. And when they were having the big exhibition down in London to try and entice everybody to come and live in Milton Keynes, well, it was a great exhibition to go to, because as you first walked in, there was a life-size model of a sheep which actually bleated at you as you went in. Meh, meh, meh. Can imagine working that exhibition with the sheep going all day. Lamb chops for dinner. But the trouble was, everything was being pushed through so quickly that at the time that the exhibition was being prepared for, there was only one model. They had this idea that they were going to have grand models all over it so people could have a good idea of what Milton Keynes was going to look like, but only one model was ready. And it was a beautiful model. It was made in silver. It looked exquisite, but it was of the sewage works. Well, it was duly sent down to London, and somebody phoned up Derek and said, "Derek, what are we going to do? We've only got the sewage works model. We can't just show that to encourage people to come to Milton Keynes." And Derek Walker turned around and he said, "Well, just tell everybody that if this is what we do for shit, imagine what we'll do for people." Probably not the best advertising slogan Milton Keynes has ever come up with. Maybe this is why we progressed to concrete cows and roundabouts. One of the last urban myths I'm going to tell you about is quite a personal one in many ways. You see, I listened to that loud narrative that I told you about at the beginning. I listened to Milton Keynes has no cultural heritage, even though I knew it was wrong, even though my whole PhD was looking at going, this is wrong, I'm going to find out why. But when I sat down to write my questions and plan my thesis, some part of me had listened to that story, because I decided I was going to set out to find these people in Milton Keynes who had a bad sense of place. I was going to find them, and through my power of storytelling, I was going to change their opinion so that they could be proud to live in Milton Keynes. And then I started doing my interviews. And every person I asked them the question, "So, do you have a poor sense of place?" And they said, "No, actually, I really quite like living in Milton Keynes. Actually, it's got quite a lot going for it. I'm quite glad I'm here." I went, "Ah. Oh, well, do you think anybody else has a poor sense of place?" "Oh, yes, yes, yes. The people who live over in that area of Milton Keynes, they have a terrible sense of place." I went, "Oh, thank you very much." So I went over to that part of Milton Keynes and I started asking my questions. And I said, "Oh, do you have a bad sense of place?" "Well, some people think that we do, but actually, we really quite like it here." "Oh, but the people over there, they're a terrible sense of place." So I went over there and I started asking them. And again and again and again, every place I went, I asked the people, "Do you have a poor sense of place?" And they went, "No, we think they do." And that is the urban myth in Milton Keynes. I can't find that many disparaging stories. I can't find this mythical bad sense of place. When I actually ask people, they like where they live. There's always something that they can find good about it. if you're sat here and you're thinking, well, actually, I have a terrible sense of place, I think Milton Keynes is awful, then great, come and speak to me. You might be the person to save my PhD.
That person is me.
That person is you. Great, we'll speak after. But in the meantime, most of what I'm finding are people are proud of Milton Keynes, and when they find out that its stories extend much longer than the last 50 years, when they find out that there are so many unusual things that have gone on to it, well, that is what makes Milton Keynes unique. That's what makes Milton Keynes magic in my eyes, and much more than concrete cows and roundabouts. And I have to say that when coming to do these performances, I have such a hard time of what stories to pick, because there are so many I could tell you. I could tell you about the Roman Fenny forger. Fenny Stratford had a forger who was nicking from the Romans. That's a good local lad. There's a story about a parrot down in New Bradwell who changed the lives of many people and brought a bit of magic with ponies of the boaties. There are so many stories of grave diggers and ghosts. There might even possibly be a story of a vampire. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of that one. Milton Keynes is filled with stories, and so I have one last story for you, which is one that I wrote for Milton Keynes. Once upon a time, there were too many people and not enough houses. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? The government decided to tackle this problem. They would create new towns, and the biggest, the largest, and the greatest of them all, they named Milton Keynes. And people moved here from all over the country, all over the world, in their thousands. The houses were new, the people were new, everything was new, and Milton Keynes sparkled in its newness. But the other towns and villages, well, they started to get a bit jealous. They started to laugh at Milton Keynes and make jokes that it was only new. And that meant that it had no heritage, and that meant it wasn't as good as the other towns and the other villages. And Milton Keynes started to feel a bit miserable, a bit sad. But when it turned 50, it thought to itself, now I'm not so new, people must like me better. But the jokes about roundabouts and concrete cows and yoghurt having more culture still abounded. And it was around about that time that a passing storyteller came through and heard these jokes and stopped and looked around. The people of Milton Keynes seemed too busy in their daily lives to notice the stories sticking out and peeking from all sorts of places. And so she called the stories and gathered them up, and she took these stories to the people of Milton Keynes, and she showed them and she shared them. And now the people of Milton Keynes, they became the storytellers. They became their own curators of heritage through what they chose to pass on. And they learned that the difference between Milton Keynes and a yoghurt is that Milton Keynes has stories and therefore heritage. Thank you.